Alrighty, Nish here, back at you with another episode. Welcome to the Impact Co podcast series finance edition. If you clicked on the thumbnail here, you might be a bit of a glutton for punishment because the title talks about dividends, and it's not exactly a sexy topic, if I'm being honest. But there's so much misconception with it that I feel like it's one of those things we just need to discuss, because as someone in finance, someone who studied finance, someone who's worked in finance for over a decade now, I obviously have context around dividends, the tax treatment around dividends, why dividends gets paid, why it's important to understand the reasoning behind dividends, why it might start, why it might stop, etc. But most people don't understand that. Now, my parents, both teachers, my dad had a few stocks at a time when people of my dad's generation, especially being a person of color, if you haven't watched the video, I'm an Indian person born in Durban, South Africa. He did have a few stocks. He had a reasonable amount of financial knowledge, especially given the fact that it was difficult to gain financial knowledge back then. There were no podcasts, there were no websites you could easily read, etc. And I remember he used to tell me that he used to get dividends from a few stocks that he used to get. But the way he would contextualize dividends was interesting. He would almost talk about it as free money. Okay. And I think that's where a lot of people misconstrue the idea of dividends, that dividends is this money that sort of comes out of the ether, and if you get dividends, it's sort of this extra cash that you were never expecting, which seems great. You know, I think our generation, the generation that knows that you get nothing for free, realizes that that can't be the case. So we're more circumspect when it comes to getting any sort of money, and that it isn't for free. And that is true. Dividends comes from somewhere, and you are giving up something for receiving dividends. And I want to discuss that, but also sort of get into this idea that to understand financial markets, you have to have a little bit of accounting knowledge. Now, I know saying that you need to have accounting knowledge is usually a time for you to stop listening to whatever you were listening, because accounting is boring. It is technical. It is a language in the sense that it's very defined, and you have to have this history of accounting to be able to understand it properly. And if you haven't gone to school for accounting, that might seem intimidating. But accounting is actually not as complicated as you think. Not if you need a working understanding of accounting, at least. And I think this episode on dividends is going to sort of clear some of that up. And I'll take it into further episodes where I talk about the income statement and the balance sheet, from the perspective of how you use very simple terms to understand what you need to understand to then understand financial markets. I don't need to be fluent in French to be able to visit Paris and order a croissant. You know, that's the kind of thing that is important in my podcast series. It is, what do you need to know to get going more than anything else? So we'll come to that probably in the next episode, but we'll start the journey here. Also, if you're watching this podcast on YouTube, yes, it is wear a puffer jacket in your home season in Cape Town. It is that cold. And if you're listening to this and you're in the Western Cape, you'll know exactly what I mean, because it's been extremely cold and wet the last few weeks. If you're listening to this anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere, that's great. We envy you. It's summer there. You guys seem to be living your best life. All right, let's dive straight in. So let's assume you've bought shares in this company. This company sends you, I don't know, a letter, an email, effectively saying to you, listen, we're paying out a dividend at the end of this financial year. You're going to get that money in your bank account after tax. Now, we're not going to talk about tax. We're just going to talk about the dividend part of that. We'll get to taxes in all contexts around financial markets later. I'm not exactly a tax accountant, but I know what I need to get by. So you get this dividend announcement. Let's assume you have 100 shares. They're giving out 1 Rand per share, 100 Rand. Free money? Maybe, maybe not. Now, as much as this is 1 Rand a share and you own 100 Rand a share and you own 100 shares, doesn't seem like a lot of money. If the company has 1 million shares in issue, they're paying out 1 million Rand for each of those shares. Every shareholder gets treated the same in this context. They're paying out $1 million. And depending on the size of the company, that might be substantial, it might be not. Now, for starters, when we start a company day one, and I've discussed this in a couple of episodes, couple of reels, we have to fund that company. And there's two primary ways to fund a company. That is via equity or via debt. Now, whichever way you go, funding the company effectively means an inflow of cash. Okay? If you're borrowing money from a bank, money is going to flow in from the bank, and you're going to have to pay off that bank eventually, but you've got R1,000,000 in cash, okay, for example, and that R1,000,000 in cash you're going to use to do whatever you need to do. You needed funding for something. Maybe you needed to buy equipment. Maybe you needed sort of 6 months to a year's worth of salaries for your employees. Maybe you needed sort of a marketing budget. Maybe you needed to buy a whole bunch of tech and computing if you wanted to build something online, for example. Generally, you need some startup capital, and capital is either debt or equity. Now, debt's easy. Borrow from the bank, pay it off at some point. There's an interest rate attached to it. You pay interest every year. Very normal debt stuff. If you've ever taken out a loan on a car or a house, you'll know what I'm talking about. Equity, slightly different. You're effectively bringing that equity holder in as a partner in the business. Okay? And let's assume that you do have 1,000,000 shares, like my earlier example. Those 1,000,000 shareholders effectively participate in the profits of the business. Now, you're going to set up the arrangement up front on how much 1,000,000 shares owns in a business. Let's assume you're saying 1,000,000 shareholders will be 50% of the business. Well, then you're saying there's another 1,000,000 shares somewhere that either could still be distributed in time or that maybe belong to you, as you're the CEO and you're obviously sort of carrying this business forward. A lot hinges on your business. Either way, those 1,000,000 shareholders that are not you and you are now going to split those profits 50-50 after every single year of operations, effectively. Okay. Now, how do you split those profits after every year? Well, that's where we get into the dividend conversation. Okay. So we've now funded our business. Let's assume there's no debt, there's no bank involved. We've just got equity investors. They put up $1,000,000. That is worth sort of 50% of the business. Let's assume you give yourself 1,000,000 shares and maybe you put in $1,000,000 also. That's the other half of the business. 2,000,000 Rand of startup capital. You go ahead and buy all the stuff that you need. Your business is now ready to go. You're operating day one, January 1st, 2024, and you start doing whatever you're doing, right? Selling widgets, cutting hair, doing gardening services, whatever your business does. Okay, it doesn't matter in this context. From day one, we assume that you're sort of making some money, right? You're selling this product, you're selling the service, people are buying it, you're bringing money in. That is revenue. Okay, and that is an accounting concept. We either call it revenue or we call it sales. Okay, pretty simple. It's just a payment for the work that you've done. Now, realize that for every Rand of revenue, there's going to become something called a cost of revenue. Effectively, the cost of doing business. If I'm going to run an Uber, right? Remember, the startup capital might have been used to buy the car, ready to go, and I have the car day one. I start doing Uber trips. The revenue is what my Uber money that comes in is, right, from the rides that I'm doing. What's the cost of goods? What is the cost of revenue? It is petrol, for example. Maybe the servicing that I need to do on the car. Maybe it's food for myself because I need to eat. I'm my own employee in this case. If I have multiple employees, maybe I'm paying them. Well, generally I'll pay them salaries, which is a cost of doing business. But I could also have, a lunch amount that I give them per day, for example. So you have your incoming revenue, but you're going to have a number of costs underneath that you need to sort of have this business going. Now, there's an initial level of that called cost of revenue, and then a whole bunch of other expenses. I'm just going to lump them all together. All the costs associated with you providing that service and bringing in 1 Rand of revenue. Okay, done. If you take your revenue and you subtract everything it costs to get you that 1 Rand of revenue, effectively, you have profit at the end. Okay, all the revenue coming in, all the costs to provide that revenue, profit at the end. That profit technically is attributable to the shareholders of the business, which is you and the 1,000,000 other shares that you pitched out there. Okay, and that is effectively the cycle of business per annum. Every single year, you generate revenue. Of course, that revenue costs something to generate profit. Obviously, we have things like tax that goes off. We have interest to debt holders if we have any debt. We don't in this business. So we're going to pay off some tax at the end of the year. And then the money that's left over then gets pushed over to a different part of your accounting statement, the balance sheet. We'll get there in a future episode. And that technically belongs to the shareholder. Now, if you don't pay a dividend, the money, that profit figure at the end of the year, gets transported to the balance sheet and exists in a section of the balance sheet where we keep track of everything related to equity and equity shareholders. Okay? If we decide to pay that money out as dividends, that money will then leave the balance sheet because it's actually a physical payment you're making and get paid over to all the shareholders. So in this case, we were doing 1 Rand per share of dividends, right? If you remember my initial example. So you as the 50% holder, the owner of the business, will get 1 million Rand, right? You own 1 million shares. And then the other shareholders, however many shares they might have amongst themselves, will also get 1 Rand per share, which will be 1 million Rand split up amongst them. You paid out $2 million, right? And let's assume that's the profit that you made for the cutting people's gardens in the Western Cape of South Africa. Okay? That is all well and good. Realize that if you don't pay out that dividend, it effectively sits there on the balance sheet of an accounting statement. And it's actually carried into next year, right? And let's assume we make profits every single year, 2 million upon 2 million upon 2 million for 10 years, right? So that's my brain almost blanked on what 2 times 10 was, but effectively we made 20 million Rand worth of after tax profit every single year. And every year we didn't pay that out as dividends. We just kept it on the balance sheet. Let's assume we didn't do anything. We just kept it in like a bank account with no interest, nothing, right? So 10 years down the line, we have 20 million bucks just sitting there, right? That money still belongs to the shareholder, even though we have the shareholders, even though we haven't paid them out as dividends. So dividends is almost this physical manifestation of your ownership, right? It's a reward for being an owner delivered to you as physical cash, okay? But in the normal course of business, there are many, many companies that either pay a very small dividend of their profits or pay no dividend whatsoever. And those companies still have that accrued value for their shareholders. They just haven't distributed it in the form of cash. So the first question you're going to ask me is, well, surely the guys with dividends are better off because they're getting this cash every single year, right? The guys who just had this dividend accrue for 10 years, what benefit do they have? When will they ever get a benefit from this 20 million Rand that you've made over 10 years? That is where the element of share prices is crucial. Now, in this company situation I've talked about, it's sort of a private company in the sense that the company is not listed. It doesn't have a ticker on Bloomberg, on the JSE, on the S&P 500. It's just this private business where me as the owner and the other shareholders got together and started this thing privately. Okay. If I were to list the business tomorrow, which I can do, it's not that complicated to do. I will discuss why in future episodes why I might want to list my business. But if I list it and if I get a ticker, it's now available in all indices, anybody can become a shareholder. Those potential shareholders on the different exchanges like the S&P 500 and things will need to value my shares, right? And sort of determine a share price that this thing will be listed at. In the example where I've accrued my profits every single year for 10 years, the share price of my company will be higher than for the company that's distributed dividends every single year. Now, logically, I think that makes sense, right? These new shareholders who've just come in on day one, right, are effectively buying into this pool of 20 million that has never been distributed and is sort of there, freely available to be used still, okay? They must pay more for that. You know, that money could be distributed as dividends, which they will then participate in. Okay? Therefore, they will pay more. So if I sort of boil my example back, if I listed the company where I paid out dividends every year, that company's share price will be lower than the other company which I listed and where I kept all my profits for 10 years. The market's not stupid. It's going to pay for an asset base, and that 20 million Rand of dividends is still sitting in a bank account, a no interest bank account somewhere, ready to be deployed or ready to be used as dividends. That is a crucial point when it comes to dividends versus no dividends. Because in my initial question where I said, surely a company that pays out dividends is better than a company that doesn't from a shareholder perspective because you're getting cash? Not necessarily. For the company that hasn't paid out dividends, the value of that dividends doesn't disappear. It's sort of always there. Okay? And the more profits we make and the more we keep inside a business, the higher and higher the value of that company goes over the company where dividends gets paid out every single year. That is important. In my private company example, those million shareholders that weren't me, if one of them wanted to sell some of their shares, the person buying those shares would pay them for those shares and have to take into account of this 10 years of profit sitting on the balance sheet. Okay, so dividends are great, but if you don't get paid a dividend, that dividend is still reflected in your share price, which leads me to a next very cool point that no one really realizes. When a company pays out dividends, technically speaking, and this is true as much as you might not be able to track it properly on something like Bloomberg when you look at share prices. Let's assume my company is now listed and its share price is 20 Rand per share. Okay, now forget about how I came up with that number. That's just the number. Okay, if I pay out 1 Rand per share in dividends for every single shareholder, and we know that worked out to 2 million Rand, but just 1 Rand per share. On the day after I pay that out, technically speaking, my share price should go from 20 Rand per share to 19 Rand per share. Why? I've paid out 1 Rand per share out to the shareholders. It doesn't exist inside the company anymore. If I didn't pay out that dividend, my share price should still remain at 20 Rand per share. Crucially important, because it leads us to the fact that you can manufacture your own dividend without having been paid a dividend. Okay, for the company that paid out a dividend that is now worth 19 Rand per share, if they keep paying out dividends, their share price is going to go lower, right? And this is sort of a steady state company that's not moving forward anymore, right? But for the shareholder who's not getting paid dividends and is worried about that, they can just sell some of their shares to manufacture a dividend. Your share price is capturing the fact that you haven't been paid a dividend by staying higher. And the company that's paying out dividends is slowly getting, the share price is falling by that dividend every single time. Fairly. Okay, but if you really need a dividend, right, you can just sell a couple of shares which has accrued the dividend in already and effectively make your own dividend, which many people don't realize. I have a lot of investors, and I've spoken to a lot of investors who have certain investing strategies where they only want to invest in dividend companies. And sometimes there's good reasoning behind that. But for some people it is, I want an income from my companies in the form of dividends. And my argument to them is you can just make that dividend yourself. You don't need to find dividend paying companies. Okay. So the way people think about dividends is wrong. It's not free money. Your share price will change when your dividend gets paid. And you can actually manufacture your own dividends even if a company doesn't pay out a dividend. Now, why do a lot of companies not pay out a dividend? Well, they understand that people can manufacture their own dividends, but realize that as you go forward in a company year after year, you actually need your own cash to reinvest inside your business. If I'm doing gardening services, for example, right, my lawnmowers, my weed eaters, my other tools are going to get older. And at some point, I'm going to need to replace them. Maybe I need to hire more staff because I'm sort of expanding a bit. And remember, once I start expanding my business, I need capital again, right? If I don't have cash sitting there in the form of profits that I'm able to do that with, then I'll have to go and find new shareholders or raise debt from the bank. So there are many companies that do retain a significant portion of their profits to be able to reinvest into their business into the future so that they don't have to go and find capital again, which is a very rational thing. Okay, that profit will go into the business. And in my example, where I say I want to hire more staff, expand a little bit more, buy new equipment, etc., that expansion of the business will lead to more revenue and more profits. So reinvesting into the business allows my business to get bigger. It's often the case, that's why it's often the case, that smaller growing companies will often pay no dividend for a very long time because they are constantly reinvesting inside their own business to make their business bigger and larger. And often the companies that pay dividends and have paid dividends for a long time are those companies that are actually quite mature. They've gotten to a phase where they don't need to reinvest in their business that much. Their business is kind of in its steady state now. If they had to reinvest in their business, it actually might be wasteful. Maybe they'll go and enter into areas that they shouldn't. Maybe they'll buy into certain things that they don't really need to. The business is on a flywheel. Everything's going well. They don't actually need the extra cash. In that case, a mature company will pay out quite a significant dividend and a consistent dividend because it sort of knows that it's in the steady state. Okay? So whether a company pays out dividends or not also gives you a sense of what company management is thinking. You know, if they're constantly reinvesting, it's telling you that, hey, we're a growing business in a growing field and we want to reinvest. And look, if you need cash, sell some of your shares, but we're going to need the cash to reinvest into our business. And if you buy into that idea, you're going to hold on to the stocks as the share price rises. And we're not going to make our share price go down by giving out dividends, nor do we want to go and raise capital somewhere else. Okay, we've made this cash ourselves. Why not reinvest in ourselves to do better? Okay. On the other hand, a mature company paying out dividends is kind of signaling to the market, hey, listen, we know we've got this cash cow business now that's churning out cash. Instead of us going and doing crazy things like trying to enter new areas and venture out and doing new things, we don't need the cash so much anymore. So we're going to start a dividend policy. We're going to steadily start to pay out dividends. And every single year, we're going to keep a bit of profit to maybe just keep the business going. And the rest of it, we're happy to pay out as dividends to our shareholders who have been loyal for many, many years. We're happy that our share price comes down by the dividend, but the share price should stay reasonable if the business is growing every single year, just by its normal growth, not this exponential growth. Also completely fine. And from that sense, we do get signaling from dividends that is important. And this is why a number of newer companies don't like paying dividends. There's been this historic trend where if you are a dividend paying company, it says that you're in the sort of more mature phase. And if for whatever reason you change your dividend policy in terms of how much you pay, how frequently you pay, it is perceived to say something about the health of your business. That's problematic. Let's say if you're a Coca-Cola, for example, and you've paid consistent dividends for the last like 20 or 30 years. That's you saying to the market, listen, we're mature, we're Coke, we're global, we make a decent profit every year, we're going to give you your dividend every year. On the 1 year where you decide, hey, listen, we've had a COVID pandemic, we need to cut our dividend because we actually need the cash because we're quite worried about the global pandemic and what it's going to do to the world and our operations and our employees. That has in the past been a reason for people to sell your company and for that share price of the company to come down because you're effectively signaling that there's some underlying issues inside your business. Now, I know a COVID pandemic affected everyone, but if you do it in sort of normal times, it is signaling to the world, signaling to the financial market that you might have a problem inside your business. Now, new companies, or any company for that matter, doesn't like to be forced into that situation because there's now information signaling inside dividends, which is not exactly something that many companies want. They pay a dividend, sure, but paying or not paying the dividend or changing the dividend policy is not necessarily feedback on how the company is doing. So there are a variety of companies now that don't necessarily pay a dividend. We're talking about very large companies, or pay a very, very small dividend, or actually use sort of a newer philosophy called share buybacks. Now, I will come to share buybacks. It is a whole episode in and of itself. It is not dividends, but the form it takes from an accounting perspective, it sort of looks the same as dividends on a balance sheet. And I promise we will get to that. It's been a very important theme thus far. The point of this episode is to say, again, because we've said it a few times now, there are financial topics that are just badly understood by financial market participants, and I don't blame anyone necessarily because a lot of people haven't studied accounting or haven't studied finance. When it comes to dividends, It is a policy that a company can adopt to return profits to shareholders. But they will do that in very specific scenarios, and we shouldn't expect every single company to pay dividends. It really depends on where they are in their life cycle. Over and above that, if a company doesn't pay a dividend, it's not a bad thing. It might be because that company is reinvesting in itself, and the financial market accounts for companies that pay dividends versus companies that don't pay dividends. So if a company pays a dividend, it's not going to be more highly valued because it's dishing out money to its shareholders, because that money is not available to reinvest. And same for companies that aren't paying dividends. That money is still on the balance sheet, ready for shareholders whenever they might be willing to pay dividends, and the market knows that too. So a dividend paying company is not better or worse than a non-dividend paying company. And if a company does not pay dividends, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't invest in that company. You can manufacture your own dividends by selling shares of that company whenever you want. Of course, the tax treatment in your country around selling shares versus dividends is important, but we'll get to that a little bit later when we discuss taxes in the context of investments. The final thing is that dividends is not free money. If a company is declaring a dividend and you're getting paid that dividend, all well and good. But just realize that your share price is going to reduce by the amount of that dividend. Okay? So it's never going to be free money. Once that dividend gets paid out, the company hopefully has enough cash to reinvest in its business for the next year. Or it might have to come to financial markets to raise that cash again, which is going to be a dilution of your ownership, which is why it's not free money if it does get dished out to you. You can also learn a lot about dividends and dividend policy from a management perspective. Good management teams are not going to pay out dividends when their companies are fast growing because they want to reinvest in their business. Good management teams also understand when their businesses are mature, so they'll start to pay out a dividend. But if you have a young growth company that is starting to pay out a dividend, for example, it's an example of a bad management team because they don't understand the philosophy around reinvesting in their business, which should be what they do. I will often look at dividends and dividends policy and the changes to dividends policy to understand management's psyche around their own business. Okay, for example, a company like NVIDIA, which is growing exponentially in this new phase, I would want NVIDIA's CEO to reinvest as much as he can to keep them at the forefront of this revolution. Whereas someone like Microsoft, for example, has a number of and don't get me wrong, I've said this in this podcast before, Microsoft is on the forefront of AI in a variety of perspectives, but there are certain businesses inside Microsoft, business units, that are in their mature phase. And for those companies, dividends should be paid out in theory. And we are seeing that from Microsoft more and more. All right, if you've gotten to this point in the episode, hopefully dividends make a little bit more sense, because I've just heard people talk very poorly about the concept of dividends, and this should get you in and out so that you understand exactly what dividends are. As always, if you've come to this point in the episode, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching. We've gotten a bunch of support on our different social media platforms, as well as on the platforms where we post the podcast, which is great. It's really nice to get good feedback. If you want to, like, subscribe, comment if you can, either here or on our Instagram page. You can find us on a number of different social media accounts, including TikTok now, which is quite cool. And obviously follow, if you can, on the different podcast networks, podcast channels. It all helps in terms of support. So thank you all. We'll see you in the next episode. Cheers and stay safe.